Alright, so today I want to talk about bulking and cutting, since it seems to be a topic of debate at the moment within the online fitness community. So I thought I would give my opinion as well as some practical advice that you guys can implement into your daily lives in the pursuit of muscle growth. Let's start out by defining bulking just so we're clear. Bulking is the process of consuming more calories than what is required to maintain an individual's weight in order to increase the amount of muscle mass they are building from training. Spoiler alert, I do think that bulking is beneficial for muscle growth, but not the way that most people do it. To start out this video, I want to break down a couple of peer-reviewed scientific studies that investigate the effects of overfeeding on muscle gain. There isn't a ton of research out there about this, so I'm only going to cover two studies that directly evaluated the effects of calorie surpluses on muscle gain, but it's all we really have at the moment in terms of scientific studies. I do also think that both of these studies have their issues, which I'm going to cover when I get to my critiques. But before we do that, let's get into the results of each one. So the first study I'm going to cover was published in 2023 and split 17 subjects into three groups. The first group ate at maintenance calories, the second group ate an amount of calories that would increase their body weight by 0.4 to 0.6% every 2 weeks, and the final group ate an amount of calories that would increase their body weight by 1.4 to 1.6% every 2 weeks. The participants all followed the same resistance training program for a period of 8 weeks, and at the end of the 8 weeks, the researchers measured skinfold thickness to approximate body fat, squat and bench 1 rep max, body mass, muscle thickness of the biceps, triceps, and quads. There was no evidence to suggest that calorie surpluses increased overall muscle thickness or squat 1 rep max. However, they did find strong evidence that the high calorie surplus group increased bench 1 rep max when compared to the moderate calorie surplus and maintenance groups. They found moderate evidence that the high calorie surplus group increased skinfold thickness more than the moderate calorie surplus group, and weak evidence that the moderate calorie surplus group increased skinfold thickness more than the maintenance group. They also found that increases in body mass are tightly correlated with increases in skinfold thickness and slightly correlated with changes in bicep muscle thickness. I want you guys to understand exactly what all of this means. When I say they found strong, moderate, or weak evidence, it's because the results that they get aren't consistent across every single subject in every single group. When you do research like this, you get a lot of variance in your results, which means your data is spread out and oftentimes not very clear. So you're really working with the average result of each group rather than the result of individual participants. Sometimes data more clearly favors one hypothesis over another, which we would call strong evidence. Other times the data only favors a hypothesis slightly, which we would call moderate or weak, depending on how large the difference is between data in each group. Let's look at the changes in muscle thickness to help you understand that. You can see that in the biceps, one participant in the high calorie surplus group gained much more muscle than anyone else in the entire study. However, there was also a participant in the high calorie surplus group that gained less muscle than anyone else, regardless of which group they were in. In fact, according to their data, the poor guy actually lost muscle during this study. This is what I mean when I say the data is spread out. And this brings me to one of the problems that I have with this study. One of the things that helps correct for outliers and excessive spread of data is having a very large sample size. This study only tested 17 people total, which means there were only 5 or 6 people in each group. That really isn't enough, in my opinion, to draw significant conclusions. If the study had more people, you would begin to see a consistent trend among each group. To help you understand how that would happen, let's take a look at a simple example. The chance of flipping a coin and getting heads is approximately 50%. However, if you only flip a coin 2 times, you might get heads both times. Does this mean that the chances of getting heads is 100%? No, of course it doesn't. It just means you haven't flipped the coin enough times for the true probability to manifest itself. The same thing goes for research studies, which is why working with larger sample sizes is ideal. Another issue I have with this study is that the participants had mixed training experiences, meaning that some people were more advanced than others. As I'm sure many of you know, people are much more sensitive to training when they are less experienced, so this is another huge flaw in this study, in my opinion. To their credit, the researchers did require a minimum of 1 year of resistance training experience, defined as training at least 2 times per week with no breaks of more than 2 weeks in succession. Either way, I wouldn't consider that criteria as something that defines an experienced lifter. And they didn't mention the training experience of each individual subject, so for all we know, it could range anywhere from 1 year to 5 or 10 years, or even more. This is a huge problem because less experienced lifters will progress a lot faster than someone who has been lifting for 10 years. I think it's also worth mentioning that this study only took place over the course of 8 weeks, and regardless of experience, I don't know if the instruments they use to measure muscle thickness are even sensitive enough to detect the amount of muscle growth that would occur in such a short time frame. This brings me to another problem I have with this study. They used ultrasound to measure muscle thickness, which is generally a pretty accurate tool, but it does have its limitations. That could be a potential place for error, as well as some of the other tools they used to measure. For example, they used Skinfold tests to approximate body fat gain. Skinfold tests are generally fairly inaccurate, and their accuracy depends entirely upon the person who is administering the test. If they are not proficient in their ability to perform Skinfold tests, then you can pretty much disregard the results that come from them. If they wanted more accurate results, using something like MRI would have been ideal, but I'm assuming they couldn't get the funding for that, so I understand why they didn't use it. My last issue with this study is that they allowed the participants to track their own food intake. I shouldn't even have to mention this, but people are generally very bad at accurately tracking their calorie and macronutrient intake. To add insult to injury, food labels are legally allowed to be wrong by up to 20%, so there's even more room for error there. If we wanted genuine results from this study, the researchers should have tightly controlled every single variable that they possibly could have. And this is a common problem among exercise and nutrition studies. Your entire life is a variable, so it's very difficult to attribute causation to something when there are so many confounding factors at play. Think about all the things that can affect muscle gain: stress, sleep, training, genetics, nutrition, experience, exercise execution, effort, and the list goes on. The researchers did control many of these variables, but at the end of the day, there are a lot of things that they didn't control which could definitely impact the results of the study. For example, while they controlled calorie intake, they only gave minimum requirements for macronutrients, with those being at least 1.8 of protein per kilogram of body weight, at least 20% of their calories from fat, and at least 40% of their calories from carbohydrates. While this is good, it leaves some room for variation in macronutrient distribution between subjects, which can definitely affect the results of the study. And yes, I understand that finding people who are willing to have every aspect of their food intake controlled down to the very last gram of protein is difficult, so I understand why they may have been more lenient on their nutrition requirements. And none of what I'm saying is to hate on the people who conducted this study or the people who cite this study. I'm just saying that the results need to be taken with a grain of salt, which the researchers even acknowledged in the paper itself. As scientists, we need to have the ability to be critical of one another, not for the sake of putting someone down, but rather for the sake of continuing the progression of our collective knowledge. With that being said, let's move on to the second paper. This was a pilot study, so it's even less reliable than the study we just talked about. Pilot studies are basically conducted to test the feasibility of a certain study design to see if it's able to be scaled to a larger population size using better methods at a later time. This study was published in 2019 and split 11 male bodybuilders into two groups. The first group consumed higher calories, about 67.5 kilocalories per kilogram of body weight per day, and the second group consumed a moderate amount of calories, about 50.1 kilocalories per kilogram of body weight per day. The participants followed a 6-day per week resistance training program over the course of 4 weeks. After the training period, the researchers measured body mass and body composition. The higher calorie group increased body fat by about 7.4%, whereas the moderate calorie group increased body fat by only 0.8%. Both groups significantly increased muscle mass, with the higher calorie group increasing by 2.7% and the moderate calorie group increasing by 1.1%. Now, just because these findings support my opinion on bulking doesn't mean that I'm going to hold back with my criticisms. We run into the same issue here as we did with the first study. The sample size is too small. You can't expect to see significant trends in small sample sizes when so many confounding variables are at play. However, I think the biggest issue that I have with this study is the way that they calculated muscle mass. They took the weight of each participant and then just used an equation to estimate the amount of muscle mass each participant had at the beginning and the end of the study. There are so many problems with this, I don't even know where to begin. First of all, if you've ever tracked your weight over a long period of time, you know it can fluctuate significantly on a daily basis. And it can fluctuate even more based on how much food, water, and salt you've had that day, what time of day you weigh in, and what clothes you're wearing when you do weigh yourself. So if they're using body weight to calculate muscle mass, then you've already failed right from the jump. Another thing is that you can't just use an equation for muscle mass and expect to get a number that's accurate enough to use in a research study, which is supposed to act as the most significant form of evidence that we have. As for the rest of my critiques, they pretty much fall in line with the first study. Using Skinfold tests to measure body fat is not reliable enough, and the training period is too short. I did mention that these were the only 2 studies I could find that directly investigated the effect of calorie surpluses on muscle gain during resistance training, but there are more studies that looked at the effect of overfeeding in general on body composition and weight gain in non-resistance trained individuals. To sum these up, people who were fed in a surplus did in fact gain lean body mass, but I want to be clear by saying that this is not the same thing as muscle mass. Lean body mass simply refers to anything in your body that is not fat mass, so things like water, organs, glycogen, bones, muscles, and so on. Either way, I would say that the overall results of the literature on the effect of calorie surpluses on muscle gain are inconclusive at best. Each study has its own set of limitations, but even if they didn't, saying something with any degree of certainty in the scientific community requires a large body of literature. So I'd like to see more data on the topic and a meta-analysis encompassing at least 10 studies before saying anything for certain. But in the meantime, let's use previously established laws of science and think about bulking purely from a logical standpoint. I've seen some arguments against bulking, saying that muscle building is signal dependent, not energy dependent. For those of you who may not be familiar, signaling is referring to the various ways that cells communicate with one another and respond to their environment. It involves a series of biochemical reactions that facilitate some sort of physiological outcome, like muscle growth. Usually it involves a molecule binding to a receptor and the subsequent phosphorylation of various proteins that eventually upregulate or downregulate gene expression. I know that sounds like scientific jargon, but genes are just things that provide instructions for building proteins. So if a gene is upregulated, then more of the protein that it codes for will be produced. There are thousands of cell signaling pathways that all go on simultaneously, so thinking that you have every aspect of human biochemistry figured out is a little bit silly in my opinion. All complexities aside, if something is quote-unquote signal dependent, then that also means it's inherently energy dependent. The molecules involved in these pathways can't just move around and react without energy, and genes can't just spontaneously create proteins without energy. In fact, none of your cells would even exist without energy. This brings us to the law of conservation of mass and energy, which is an established law of the universe that says matter nor energy can be created or destroyed, only transformed or transferred. So you can't just spontaneously create skeletal muscle tissue or anything that has physical mass without some kind of energy or mass input. To that, you may say that the energy or mass could just come from your fat stores, and that may be true to some extent, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So yes, it does require energy to build muscle. However, no one really knows exactly how much energy it requires to build 1 pound of muscle. The estimates that I have seen are usually somewhere between 2,700 calories and 3,100 calories to synthesize 1 pound of skeletal muscle. So does that mean that you should eat in a 3,000 calorie surplus so you can gain a pound of muscle per day? Obviously not. Even if you don't know anything about training or nutrition, that statement should sound absolutely ridiculous to you. This is because muscles can only grow at a limited rate, which is what a lot of people forget when they're bulking. For naturals, you're probably looking at somewhere between 2 and 10 pounds of muscle per year, depending on your genetics and training experience. Let's look at an example to see how big of a calorie surplus you would need to maximize muscle growth. Let's say for the sake of this example that it takes 2,800 calories worth of energy to build 1 pound of muscle. And let's say you're a novice trainee who is capable of building 10 pounds of muscle in their first year of training, which is a pretty generous estimate if I'm being honest. If it takes 2,800 calories to build 1 pound of muscle, then it would take about 28,000 calories to build 10 pounds of muscle. But keep in mind that's 28,000 extra calories spread out over an entire year. If you split that surplus up equally across 365 days, you're looking at only 77 extra calories per day above what it would take to maintain your current weight in order to maximize muscle growth during the most growth-sensitive period in your entire training life. I think it's safe to say that most people are not implementing a surplus of this size when they go in a bulk. Most people use bulking as an excuse to eat whatever they want in whatever quantity they want. This results in a calorie surplus that is far too large and tons of unnecessary fat gain. Believe me, I've been through it myself. And it doesn't matter if you eat quote-unquote clean foods either. even though clean eating is not even objectively definable anyway. You can eat all of the chicken, broccoli, and rice that you want. If your calorie surplus is too large, you will get fat. End of story. Take myself for example. Here's a picture of me taking the bulk way too far and eating way too much food. For the most part, my diet consisted of stereotypical clean food sources, but I was eating too much food, so I put on way too much body fat. It's as simple as that. I've also been on the other end of the spectrum, trying to gain my way into building tons of muscle. This is basically when you eat at maintenance calories to try to gain muscle without gaining fat. While it is possible to gain muscle without a calorie surplus, my results were pretty lackluster. And it makes sense logically. I was 158 pounds in these pictures here. I wanted to gain more muscle, which has physical weight to it. How could I possibly gain more muscle while eating an amount of food that keeps me at 158 pounds and no heavier? With that being said, let's get into some practical recommendations that you guys can use for your bulking and cutting phases. The first piece of advice I'm going to offer is to be honest with yourself about whether or not you're in a position where bulking is a good idea. If you're already well above 20% body fat as a male or well above 30% body fat as a female, there's really no reason for you to be bulking. Your body has plenty of energy available in the form of stored fat to fuel the muscle building process. While your body is capable of using stored fat to fuel muscle building, I believe it is only able to do so efficiently when you're not excessively lean. So if you're someone who is excessively low in body fat, or if you're an advanced trainee who is very resistant to the muscle growth training stimulus, then you should be bulking. But you should bulk intelligently, which brings me to my second piece of advice. If you've determined that you're someone who needs to be bulking, then implement a very small calorie surplus of approximately 100 to 300 calories above maintenance per day. The reason I recommend 1 to 300 and not 77 like I calculated in my earlier example is to make sure that you're actually providing sufficient energy to fuel the muscle building process. As I mentioned earlier, food labels are legally allowed a 20% margin of error on calories, macronutrients, and micronutrients. So if a food item claims to be 100 calories, it could be as low as 80 and as high as 120. So aiming for 1 to 300 calories above maintenance as opposed to 77 provides a safeguard against inaccurate tracking and inaccurate labeling. The amount of energy you expend on a daily basis will also be highly variable depending on your activity levels. Your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT, can increase significantly when you're eating more food, which basically means your body will start subconsciously fidgeting more to expend the extra energy you're getting from your increased food intake. So keep your calorie surplus small and make your gaining phase as long and as slow as possible to maximize muscle gain and to minimize fat gain. Remember, muscle building can only occur at a very limited rate, so any additional calories beyond what is required to build the tissue is just going to make you fat for no extra benefit. My last bulking phase lasted over 3 years, and I was definitely able to put on a significant amount of muscle during that time period. But I was very patient and did not try to rush the muscle building process too much. My third piece of advice is to make sure that you're focusing on training hard in a progressive nature. Providing a training stimulus is still the foundation of muscle growth, so don't forget that during your bulk. And that pretty much sums up everything I have to say about bulking, so let's briefly talk about how to approach your fat loss diet once you've finished your bulk. People are often concerned about losing muscle when they first approach a fat loss phase, and while this may be a valid concern, as long as your training program is well designed and you're following a few key strategies, maintaining every ounce of muscle during your cut is a very realistic possibility. With that being said, here are some strategies for retaining muscle mass while losing fat. The first strategy is to not make your deficit too aggressive. I would suggest something along the lines of losing about 1 pound of fat per week for most people, which works out to a 500 calorie deficit per day. These numbers, of course, depend on how heavy you are at the beginning of your cut, so if you're somebody who's a little bit heavier, then losing more than 1 pound per week is totally fine. The second strategy I have is to eat a sufficient amount of protein. Somewhere between 0.7 and 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight is usually a good number to determine daily intake. For example, eating between 126 and 180 grams of protein per day if you weigh 180 pounds. Most of the research investigating the effects of protein intake on muscle growth has shown that anything above 1 gram per pound of body weight doesn't really have much of a benefit. You can certainly eat more than 1 gram per pound though. It's perfectly safe, but probably not a lot more beneficial than eating between 0.7 and 1 gram per pound of body weight. The third strategy is to keep your fat intake above 0.3 grams per pound of body weight at bare minimum. Fats are crucial for testosterone synthesis, which is a molecule that you want to keep around if you're interested in retaining muscle mass during a cut. The next point is to keep your carbohydrate intake as high as possible for as long as possible. Carbohydrates are the undisputed king of performance nutrition, seeing as they basically fuel all of the lifting that you will be doing in the gym. The fifth strategy is to focus on eating mostly micronutrient-rich sources of food, and if you can't do that, be sure to take a multivitamin of some sort. Next is to incorporate foods that you actually enjoy eating. Remember, your diet has to be sustainable in the long term. And the next strategy is something I already mentioned when I was talking about bulking, but you need to train with the intent to progress your performance in the gym. This means keeping a training log, using good technique, training with a high level of effort, and making small incremental improvements that add up over time. Another important strategy is to be mindful of systemic fatigue. Eating in a calorie deficit while continuing to train is going to cause general fatigue to accumulate much more rapidly than when eating at maintenance or in a surplus. Be sure to incorporate fatigue management strategies like ensuring sufficient quality and duration of sleep, engaging in fun, non-gym related activities, and doing things that help you relax, whatever that may be. As far as cardio goes, my suggestion is to incorporate low-intensity cardio. I prefer walking, but the important point is that whatever cardio you choose should not interfere with the quality of your weight training. You can even do something as simple as keeping track of your step count throughout the day and being sure to hit your numbers. On a cut, I usually do between 8,000 and 13,000 steps per day, depending on what I'm doing that day, of course. The final strategy I have that you can implement is to include diet breaks or refeeds. Dieting for an extended period of time is extremely challenging, and generally speaking, your fat loss diet should be much shorter than your bulking diet. Typical fat loss diets usually range between 12 and 20 weeks, but you can break that up into segments by bringing your caloric intake back to maintenance for a few weeks to help set you up for even more successful fat loss further down the line. This will ensure that any hormonal or psychological changes that have taken place during the dieting period will return to normal before engaging in another prolonged calorie deficit. And that pretty much sums up all the advice I have for you guys about bulking and cutting. I hope you guys learned something in this video, and I hope this advice is useful for you and your physique goals. If you did find this useful, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel if you guys have not already. I appreciate the support, and I will see you guys in the next video.